The second Southern Africa Conference on Child Rights, which was held in Johannesburg last week, is an initiative that is building up on the momentum that was created by a similar conference in 2011. The last meeting brought together child rights stakeholders from Southern African countries, from government officials, legislators, academia, and the children themselves. One of the key outputs of the meeting was a resolution to set up the Child Rights Network for Southern Africa. Norma Rangana of Save the Children further elaborates.
The network on its own would help take forward the challenges facing children in the different countries. The network was a network of other networks because in each country there are networks that already exist, but there was no umbrella body that would actually take things at a regional level. So this meeting was largely to consolidate the work that was done initially in 2011, but also to introduce the network to the region so that people understand what the network is and what its role is going to be.
Rangana takes us through some of this year's conference objectives and ultimate resolutions.
The conference was not just to talk, but also to equip people with necessary skills, those who are working in the children's rights environment. Because one of the issues is that the countries are supposed to be submitting a UN report in 2013, but most civil society are not necessarily engaged in those processes. Part of the conference was to educate people on how can they actually understand what the State Party report is all about. What is expected of the different states by the UN and the AU in order to report on the rights of the child as they have agreed to. Remember, there is the two major agreements. The one is called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the other one is the African Union, which is also focusing on the rights of the child. Most of the countries in the region have actually ratified those. But part of the challenge we are sitting with is that the countries do not report. A simple example, South Africa has not submitted the last two reports, but part of the problem is that civil society has actually not been engaged in understanding what is expected of the country, but also interacting with the state as the key players. Part of this meeting was to educate people on what is expected of them, but also if they feel that the countries are not necessarily doing the work they're supposed to do, or if the policies that are in place are not friendly to children, or the state is not necessarily investing in children, what course of action can they take? Also, it was agreed by the participants that it is important that the state parties should implement the SADC Basic Minimum Package of Services. There was a conference statement that the partners agreed to. The challenge is how does that get implemented? The network that was formed, that was launched during this conference, is the one that is going to take most of the challenges that are faced by people as a collective in the region.
A 4-day event which sought to address issues relating to the health and well-being of children, especially those marginalized by orphanhood, poverty, migration, abuse and HIV and AIDS also took place last week. The Orphans and Vulnerable Children Conference held in Johannesburg was opened by the South African Deputy Minister of Women, Children and People Living with Disabilities, Hendrita Bogopane Zulu. Taking us through the successes of the meeting is Conference Chair Zolile Mlisana.
It was very, very good because, one, we had attendance from quite a significant number of African states outside of ourselves. I'm sure probably 10 or 15 outside of ourselves were in attendance, and they made contributions at all the levels that we're engaging. That was very, very helpful. And one other was serving the objective, which was really for everybody to share knowledge about the extent of the challenges on the ground. There were also some shocking highlights about certain extents of social pathology that we were aware of, but perhaps we were not all cognizant of the extent. For instance, there's always an excitement about child trafficking, and it is always looked at as something that happens across the border. But somebody made it very clear that child trafficking sometimes starts in the home, desperate mothers prostituting their children. And so she redefined what should be meant by child trafficking to an extent that causes everybody to have to open their eyes at their own doorstep. So that was a mind blower, something we know, but it was looked at with different spectacles. We all have to think differently and deeper about an issue that we're all conscious of.
Norma Rangana of Save the Children, however, says although there is an indication that child issues are being put on the political agenda, more needs to be done for debates to be translated into action.
Remember, one of the challenges we're sitting with is that we've got legislation that talks wonderfully. In most of the countries in the region, there's beautiful legislation that actually is pro-children in all aspects, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's social development. Those pieces of legislation are there. The major problem is how are they implemented? implemented. Most of the people who are supposed to implement that are not necessarily aware of these conventions. That's the first thing. And secondly, they're not aware of the way they're supposed to communicate what they've been doing. Because remember, there's a lot that is happening. That's the first thing. But the people who are actually doing something are not necessarily documenting what they are doing. And that is a problem. Yes, we may have a lot of conferences, but it doesn't translate to action.
Both the Southern Africa Conference on Child Rights and Orphans and Vulnerable Children Conference have identified the need for collaboration between civil society organizations and the government if the needs of children are to be effectively met. Reporting for Channel Africa, I am Jane Matebula in Johannesburg.